health, as well as activism and advocacy in the public health arena. I'm the co-director, Adam Myers, with Adrian Fu Berman, who's also on this seminar. And we welcome you and hope that those of you who are coming from outside the program continue to come. We have a great lineup. It's just being filled out finally over the next week or so, but the speakers we have so far are really pretty exciting. So today we have Pam Saunders, who Matt Reeser is going to introduce. I want to just say a word about how we're going to run this seminar. Dr. Saunders is going to be introduced by Matt formally, and then she's going to speak for about 45 minutes. During that time, we ask all of you to keep your microphones muted, and then Matt will moderate a question and answer session started first by the seminar students, and then opened up later to outside participants. So without any further ado, Matt Reeser.
Yeah, hi. So it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter for today, Dr. Pam Saunders. Dr. Saunders received her bachelor's degree in anthropology and linguistics from the University of Michigan. She then went on to get her master's in linguistics from the University of Pennsylvania, and then her PhD in linguistics from our very own Georgetown University. She then completed postdoc fellowships at the University of California and the University of Kansas. At Georgetown, Dr. Saunders currently serves as an associate professor in the neurology and psychiatry departments at the School of Medicine. She's also the programs chair for the Center for Innovation in Leadership and Education, and she's the program director for the Aging and Health Master's Program. Dr. Saunders is also the associate director of geriatric education at George Washington University's Center for Aging, Health, and Humanities. Her research focuses on language, aging, doctor and patient communication, narrative and reflective writing, and standardized patient education. And a fun fact about Dr. Saunders is when she was in Kansas, she was an avid storm chaser. So with that, I'll pass it on to our speaker, Dr. Pam Saunders. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Matt. That was lovely. I appreciate it. I guess avid might be a little bit of a strong word in terms of storm chasing, but there were a couple I got pretty close to, or maybe too close to. Well, that was a lovely introduction. Thank you. And thank you to Dr. Myers and Fu Berman for inviting me today. And it's actually so fun to see lots of familiar faces. I got to teach a number of you last spring, and seen others on different formats. Nice to see Peter. I'm hoping he doesn't give me too hard a time, since I gave him a hard time last time. Yeah, I don't know, he's not promising. So today I'm going to talk to you about reframing aging, which is a social change endeavor designed to improve the public's understanding of aging. Reframing Aging Initiative is a long-term grant-funded endeavor to really help people understand what ageism is and to counteract it. This is me. I'm glad that Matt mentioned that I did training in gerontology, scientific study of aging. I studied sociocultural gerontology at University of California, San Francisco, and at the University of Kansas in communication and aging, both NIH-funded postdoctoral fellowships. And that I am the founding director of the Masters of Aging and Health program at Georgetown, another interdisciplinary program like yours. And so given that background, you can understand that my interest in the goal of reframing aging. So Reframing Aging was funded by 10 organizations from a group called Leaders of Aging Organizations, LAO. So you can see across the board, American Federation for Aging Research, Geriatrics, Healthcare Professionals, AGS, Grant Makers in Aging. This was a group that had been thinking about how do we change the tune? How do we change people's ideas, help them understand what aging is, and to push back on some of the aging stereotypes that we know exist in the world? The funding came from people like the John A. Hartford Foundation and Archstone Foundation, with additional support from some smaller groups, Rose Community Foundation, Samuels Foundation. So just a little bit about Frameworks. It's a nonprofit think tank here in the DC area with a mission to advance the nonprofit sector's capacity to reframe social issues. So they have looked at issues other than aging, obesity, childhood, dependency issues. And I'm using this slide set in part because I'm a trained facilitator with the Frameworks, with the Reframing Aging Initiative. So here's my disclosure page. I was trained as a facilitator. I'm not an employee of Frameworks or the Reframing Aging Initiative. So I was actually excited to talk to you all about this because I think either you have studied or will study issues of health communication and advocacy in your program. So hopefully this will give you a peek at a social endeavor campaign that has tried to do that. What does it take to reframe an issue? So reframing involves research, looking at messaging, and looking at strategies to help advocates of the issue and communicators create messages. The Reframing Aging Initiative did this using the following 3 steps. First, they mapped the terrain. They looked at what people were saying and thinking about age. They looked at gaps between how experts think and talk about aging and how the public thinks about and talks about aging. And then they developed and tested strategies for filling in those gaps in order to help the public understand the messages as the experts intended. So then the Frameworks Institute took these strategies and started disseminating them. And being a facilitator is one way I help to disseminate. They want to train people in aging services organizations, in government agencies, in academics to be part of the caravan. So you guys are on your first steps of being part of this caravan to start reframing aging. So Frameworks did a lot of research. Over 12,000 different individuals helped with the research, participated. And they used a number of different social science research methods, some of which you may have studied in your first class at the beginning of the semester: sociology, anthropology, some health communications research methods, to gather data on people's thinking about aging. Their goal was to have a nationally representative samples to be able to make recommendations with confidence about these strategies and how they would apply across audiences across the US. Frameworks Institute looked at strategies that worked for all sorts of demographic groups. So they tried to be stratified in terms of race, ethnicity, socioeconomic background, age, political identification, among other variables. So let me give you a little taste of some of the research that they did. So this little experiment had people rate the following words, and you see them at the top of your screen: senior, elder, senior citizen, older person, older adult. And people had to rate those words on a Likert scale from 1 being least, 5 being most. And they rated them on a number of competencies, including technologically capable, frail, wise, independent. So they categorized each of those words on each of those competencies. So when you think of senior, do you think of them as the least technologically capable or the most? When you think of the word senior, do you think those are the least wise? Or does that word evoke least wise or most wise? So they took the data and they averaged it and created an overall measure of perceived confidence that I'm going to show you here on the next slide. So the big picture here is that words matter. And so when mapped, you see each of those terms, senior, elder, senior citizen, older person, older adult, mapped on this least to most competent. And in summary, you see senior as perceived as the least competent, elder, then senior citizen, then older person, and older adult, that term is perceived as the most competent. In the bottom graphic, you see the results of another experiment. Researchers asked participants to rate these words in terms of how old they thought the person was. So they rated the term senior as being around 69, then elder, followed by senior citizen is a little younger, older person is a little younger, and older adults at 54 years old, which means that I'm clearly in the older adult stage right now. That'll be another story. So it's interesting when you see these results because older adult seems to be the preferred term. That's the term I typically use. And then, but the results of that little experiment that you see on the bottom suggest kind of an issue, which is that when people are using the term older adult, they're thinking of people in their mid-50s, but often the programming that we offer and the policies that we write are targeted for people a lot older than that. So why framing? Why does framing matters? So during this talk, I'll talk about why framing matters for experts and advocates, and how framing can make a difference in how people understand your message. And it's a critical part of this change strategy to combat ageism. So framing is about choices. If you studied sociology, you may have studied Irving Goffman, who was one of the first to talk about frames and framing. Frames are a set of choices about how information is presented, what to emphasize, how to explain it, what to say or leave unsaid. Everybody frames. We all are communicators. We all make communication choices in everything we say, whether we're conscious of them or not. So cultural models is another important part of this. You may have studied this a little bit when you studied your bits of sociology over the end of the summer. Cultural models are cognitive shortcuts that we create through our life experience, through our expectations. They're kind of taken for granted and largely automatic assumptions. People rely on cultural models to interpret, to organize, to make meaning out of all sorts of stimuli, including experiences, feelings, thoughts, and your communication. So in the absence of expert knowledge about an issue, we, the public, default to culturally dominant assumptions about the world and how it works and how to reason about unfamiliar, complicated issues. Anthropologists are the ones who probably developed the term cultural model. So when we frame messages, cultural models are important, and it's the basis of creating strategic communication. So there are lots of cultural models that are available. Some are more productive than others when you're trying to frame a message. And your goal is to tap into cues that invoke cultural models that will be supportive of your messages. If we know what cultural models are being accessed, then we can better frame a message. If we know what models people have for thinking about issues, including aging, And if we know which models are helpful and which are not, we can create more productive ways of thinking. Then we can choose cues for our messages that activate our most helpful and avoid activating unproductive ones. So understanding, the way we understand a message is frame dependent. And the way we all as communicators use frames to create a message has consequences for how an audience understands that message. And in the next slide, I'm going to give you an example from a study done by Snyderman and Thoreau in 2004. In their study, they were looking at participants' support for a certain message, and the message had to do with a hate rally that was being held in their community. And they measured people's level of support depending on how they framed the issue. So here is the first version, and I'll give you a second to read that. Did everybody see it okay? So given the importance of free speech, would you favor allowing a hate group to hold a political rally? So in this experiment, they found that 85% of their participants were in favor of supporting the rally when the message was framed in that way. So here's another way of framing that image or that message. Given the risk of violence, would you favor allowing a hate group to hold a political rally? So by a show of hands, do you think that number is going to be higher or lower than 85%? I'm getting some thumbs down. Yeah, there we go. So exactly. Only 40% of people were in favor of that message or of having a rally when the message was framed in that way. So we can see a simple change in frames produced a big change in people's attitudes. So this has implications for the way our choices as communicators affect public support for the policy changes that we champion. So when a frame works, it can shift thinking in multiple ways. So on the screen, you have a number of messages. A knowledge-based message, public policy shapes how successfully people age. An attitudes type message, we should increase funding for aging research and age-friendly public policy. And then more of a policy message, we need age-friendly employment policies that benefit older people and family members who might care for them. So to test whether a frame works, the Reframing Initiative conducts large-scale surveys to measure preferences about policy statements after people have been exposed to that specific framing strategy. Then researchers analyze people's responses against a control group who've received no exposure or priming. So their experimental group was primed to understand a certain message and the control group was not. And they were interested in measuring the difference in knowledge, attitudes, and support in those messages. So the statements on the screen are examples of those statements that survey participants responded to positively on the Likert scale after being exposed to a short passage. So a big reason we think about framing is called the you say, they think problem. That's where an expert puts out a message, blah, 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 and that sounds perfectly reasonable in the office or with colleagues, but that somehow when the public receives the message, a totally different response is received than the one intended. So this is another example. This was written by an advocate of aging. It was a message about ageism and workplace discrimination. I'm going to let you read this on your own. Can you see it all right? Give me some thumbs up when you're done. All right, people look like they're done reading. So this message about ageism and workplace discrimination is from a Washington Post magazine article. It was probably 10, maybe 8 to 10 years ago. And I think the expert advocate's goal was to give people this concerning example in order for them to be supportive of policies for older adults and unemployment. And what the experts thought they were putting out as a message wasn't necessarily what the audience heard. Instead of being compelled to see the workplace and discrimination in the workplace as a problem, the public's thinking went in a different direction, not the direction that the advocate intended. And so here's the message in the second bubble, which is how people perceive that image or that message. And I'll let you read that for a moment. So hopefully you've finished reading the message by now. So instead of being compelled to see the workplace discrimination as a problem, the public thinking went in a completely different direction, not the direction that the advocate was intending. That people may have taken this message as a personal affront. They may have seen it as evidence that people need to stand on their own 2 feet, that perhaps they feel that this group of older adults wants more entitlements than everyone else. So here we see an example of the need for some reframing. So here is another example of you say, they think problem. This example comes from a blog post from the Brookings Institute in 2016. The bubble on the left, I'll let you read that for a second. Give me a thumbs up when you're done. Okay, looks like a lot of people are done. So the excerpt on the left is trying to convince people to support greater public support for these programs that can help older adults by emphasizing costs of inaction. And then let's look at the bubble on the right in terms of the public interpretation. I'll give you a moment to read that. People done reading? Okay, great. So the excerpt on the right while the authors were focusing on potential costs, people really interpreted the message in a different way. They really focused on their personal involvement, their own burdens. They focused on not on the greater good, but on individual concerns. So a little bit of a quick set of definitions here. I imagine you studied definitions of implicit bias and ageism elsewhere in your journeys, but it can't hurt to review a little bit. So ageism is defined as discrimination based on negative assumptions about age. Makes sense, right? And implicit bias, which is a definition that we're much more familiar with in more recent years. We teach medical students a lot about this concept. Implicit biases are attitudes and stereotypes that we're not aware of. We form these subconscious negative judgments about many things, including age. So frameworks looked at how exposing people to explanations of implicit bias actually reduce people's bias about aging. And we do know from the literature that awareness of implicit bias makes us less likely to act on snap judgments and more likely to treat people fairly. The Frameworks Institute found that exposing people to explanations of implicit bias and what it is and how it works to perpetuate ageism actually reduces people's implicit bias towards older people. So if you were to carry this message forward or become a facilitator with Frameworks Institute and Reframing Aging, you would try to do that in your messaging. When I first developed the website for the Aging and Health program, I used all the strategies that I could from the Reframing Aging initiative to put forth an age-friendly message on the website. And if you're interested in the study that they wrote about looking at measures of implicit bias and age, I'd be happy to give you that reference. So here's an example. Ageism prevents older people from contributing to the workforce. It's often that managers commonly use age-based assumptions to evaluate job seekers' applications. Even though older people tend to score especially high in leadership, detail-oriented tasks, writing skills, and problem solving, employers assume that older people are less capable. As a result, employers are less likely to interview job candidates when the graduation dates indicate more than 50 years old. And that has a lot of cascading effects because unemployed older people are much more likely to remain unemployed in the long term. So the Reframing Aging Initiative came up with a number of recommendations on how to reframe language to get the best results as advocates, experts, communicators. And they discovered, and here's two examples, ingenuity and justice were very powerful to move, and they were shown to move the needle on people's attitudes towards aging and ageism, and to create more support for aging policies and programs. So let's talk about these two metaphors. So ingenuity. So, we as a society have lots of knowledge, lots of resources. As we get older, those benefits accrue. We have more years and more knowledge, more ideas, and there's a dynamism that is captured in the older adult population. if we frame images using that metaphor of ingenuity, people will respond positively. And then justice, and I think this is a great one for Georgetown, and I like to talk about combating ageism as a social justice issue. Really, to live up to our ideals, we want to make sure that systems are in place to allow older people to participate in activities and contribute to civic life. So combating ageism, learning about aging, is a way to combat an injustice that is found in ageism. So through collective contributions, we can support change. In terms of our communications, whether we're a program for older adults, whether we're a funder, a researcher, an advocate, we can try to use messages that are supportive and well received to reframe aging. We can put those out into the public discourse on our websites, in our press releases, in the way that we write research articles. I can't tell you how many research articles I wrote with, "There's a disaster coming, we have to fix society, and there's so many older adults coming, there's a silver tsunami out there," until I realized that's really hard to swallow. It's really hard for an individual out there to comprehend how to combat a tsunami about to fall on top of them. And hopefully since I've changed the way I've written those messages. And then, with thinking and discussion, hopefully we can promote, support, and enact more age-friendly policies, practices, and programs. And I think the Reframing Aging Initiative is hoping to train people, across the field of aging, and I say that meaning a field broadly, to speak with a shared message so we can change attitudes and ultimately change behavior around these age-friendly policies and programs. So the Reframing Aging Initiatives teaches all sorts of people in all walks of life to understand what reframing aging is, and then supports them on their journey as they go and expand the caravan. So this is a quick start guide that is available on the Reframing Aging website. So I already mentioned this, this first one on the left. So instead of using these phrases and words on the left, try the matching one on the right. So instead of talking about the tidal wave or catastrophic terms for the growing older population, we try to talk affirmatively about changing demographics. Something like, as Americans live longer and healthier lives. When talking about choice or planning or control that affect individual determinants of aging outcomes. So instead of saying, if only they ate healthier when they were younger, they would be healthy now as an older adult. If only they had saved more money, they wouldn't be in this financial disaster when they're 65. Rather emphasize how to improve social contexts, find creative solutions to ensure we can all thrive as we age. Try to be inclusive instead of othering people by saying those older adults, those elderly, those aging dependents, that really invoke stereotypes. Try to use more neutral terms. And we know that older people or Americans or older adults tends to be perceived a little bit more competently. And use inclusive terms. I hope I've done that in this talk. We, as we age, I'm aging, you're aging, we're all aging, Peter's aging, I see him on the screen. It's difficult to switch those pronouns, but I do think it helps. So rather than using struggle, battle, fighting, or other conflict-oriented words to describe aging experiences, think of the building momentum metaphor. Aging is a dynamic process that leads us to new abilities and knowledge that we can share with our communities. Also try not to use the word ageism without explanation. Put out the definition, and it helps people to understand, what you're talking about. And then rather than making generic appeals to the needs to just do something, try to use concrete examples like creating intergenerational communities, educational spaces. One of the things we do in the Masters of Aging and Health is we admit students from all ages. So we have students from the 20-somethings to the 70-year-old somethings, and we have a truly intergenerational classroom that really models what the world is and allows people to practice and learn from one another. So a little bit more on ways to think of changing framing. So avoid this idea of individual action driving outcomes. Try to avoid the thought of aging as a process of decline when possible. Try not to think of older adults as other. Try not to think of aging as a population crisis. And then on the right, you see the messages we want to try to advance, which are a little bit similar to what I talked about on the last page. Create solution stories. Think about interventions that can improve outcomes. So I'm coming to the end here. I encourage you to check out the Reframing Aging website, www.reframingaging.org. They have a lot of the resources. They've got some great videos. They have the quick resource guide, this quick start guide, that if you were interested, they also have their executive summary there if you were interested in reading more about that. So that takes me to the end, and I'd be happy to hear all your questions and comments.
Great. So I think, Ella, you had your hand up first.
Yeah, I had a question on the reframing piece that was very